Hello, y'all. I'm feeling better. I appreciate everybody. First, for your patience. I mean, for real, for just realizing that, this is just a strange time for many of us. But for me, it was about the roughest I've ever had in my life. And so I appreciate that. But I'm not going to spend time on this talking about that. I'll talk to you in class Tuesday. But I wanted to kind of introduce Albert Camus the way I've been kind of doing it with everybody. Um, Certainly those who think of Camus as an existentialist has to admit the fact that, it's broadly understood that, he really didn't get down with the category of existentialist. Um, but, I'm going to try to focus here for the next 20 minutes or so on some of his main works and how he kind of went about the business of both philosophical and literary thought. That certainly um, highlighted the main themes and was the sort of his legacy, if you will. Lived a short life. Died in 1960. Born 1913. French philosopher. He was an Algerian brother. Um, um, he became very political. He was a part of the French resistance during World War II, and obviously he later became the famous author and activist that we know him of today. Um, Another person we read a little bit, the first day of class, and we'll read later. He was a good friend of Jean-Paul Sartre, but then they kind of had their issues politically, and they fell out. Um, and they fell out primarily because over issues of the Soviet Union, um, totalitarianism, um, that kind of thing. The Algerian War. It took place, I think, in the late mid 1950s, and Camus had to try to stay neutral, and he just kind of got ripped on both sides, right? Because he was neutral about the war. He did win a Nobel Peace Prize. A Nobel Prize for Literature. Excuse me. Every time I say Nobel Prize, I say peace. A Nobel Prize for Literature. Um, and Sartre won one too, but Sartre didn't accept it. But Camus did. And then, like I said, he died early on by a crash, I believe, accident. So I think I like to say that, being friends with Sartre at the time, um, sort of existentialism was sort of a very specific and um, maybe explicit discipline and a way of being in the world, right? And the kind of company they associated themselves in and with in Paris, and a lot of the conversations that they had was among like company, right? And even though he rejected the label, he was more of, and that's why one of the readings, we're not going to read it for right now, but it'll talk a little bit about it in the one we'll read. He's more of an absurdist thinker, right? And many people even consider him as maybe even the creator of absurdism. But absurdity obviously is an element of existential thought, and so we're going to begin with the Myth of Sisyphus that he wrote in 40. Don't quote me. He wrote in the 40s, and he begins with the provocative question that ultimately defines everyday life, which is there is only one philosophical problem, and that is suicide. What does he mean with that? So we'll talk about that obviously in class, but you know maybe it's just a rhetorical question or rhetorical statement. and a strategy to sort of give suicide more philosophical attention, because people don't really talk about it much in a philosophical way, obviously in a psychological way, medical way, that kind of thing, maybe spiritual way. But the question we need to ask ourselves as the class is, does it really believe it's a philosophical problem, right? And maybe it's both. I don't know. Maybe it is a philosophical problem. Maybe it isn't. I don't know. But we'll talk about that in class. Let's make sure you think about that. But when we think about the question of suicide in relationship to the meaning of life, though, which is often the sort of the foundation of philosophical questioning, especially popular philosophical question, then it is indeed a sort of a vital question to ask, even if you ask it in the inverse, which is why not just die, right? Or in other words, sort of what do we have to live for, right? And so, Camus kind of does not, well, he does sort of know that there are other philosophical questions. So you'll see in that reading that he gives other philosophical questions. But it is just the one about suicide that he feels that is fundamental and that anything else should come after, right? They are less important, or less fundamental, right? Uh, he notes in the reading that you'll have is that suicide is a reality for many people, and that many kill each other for many ideas, and for ideas and for many other reasons, right? He hones in on how the meaning of life is the most important, although it's not kind of clear how to answer that, right? We've kind of talked about that in terms of value the first week of class. But regarding suicide, right, Camus claims that it's always been sort of treated as a social phenomenon. And this is what he wants to change, because he wants to consider the relation between the thought reflection and the act, right? The thought of suicide and the act of suicide, right? So the issue of suicide then becomes a more reflective question as opposed to a reactive question, right? Obviously, there are many causes of suicide, right? So you're like, Campbell, wait a minute, what are you talking about? I killed my girlfriend, whatever. I lost my job, whatever. I'm tired of the pain of physical life. So those are the sort of the reasons, or those are the sort of the impetuses, if you will. But then he wants to get to the philosophical questions about meaning, about importance, that kind of thing. And so he has this line that you're going to read. He says that killing oneself is an act of confessing, right? And it's confessing that, it's been too much for me to handle, or I just can't understand living. Um, but obviously we all know, and that's, thank goodness for places like Wittenberg that helps us to come into who we are. But we all know that living ain't easy. It ain't supposed to be easy, right? And people often feel there's an absence or reason necessarily to live, as well with the question of uselessness of their identity, or existence of pain and suffering, all this kind of stuff that a lot of people experience, right? And then obviously we know the reality of depression, right? But sort of without the empirical evidence, sort of a priori, if you will. Hannah, I hope that don't mess you up. A priori means just by rationality alone, right? So the question of suicide then might seem to be a simple yes or no. But then for Camus, it's too easy. And so people who kill themselves often, are sure there's a meaning to life, and they still kill themselves, right? Because the meaning to life hasn't been met, right? Or something like that. On the other side, though, those who sort of logically discover the meaninglessness of life, sometimes and many times don't even think about suicide, right? Or don't even think about it long, right? So somebody like Dostoevsky, right? And, who wrote that, I know we didn't read Devils and Demons, but, he has a novel, one of his characters, I forgot his name now, but in his novel Devils and Demons, is a very interesting question that deals with suicide, right? But the matter then is just far from. It's not really. It's not simple, right? It's kind of far from simple. It's practical. It's theoretically a crucial issue to understand. And so Camus sort of does this through his, reading of the Sisyphus myth, which sort of he has immortalized, right? Obviously, the myth of Sisyphus. He was punished by the gods to push a boulder up a hill forever, only for the boulder to come down and roll down every time he reached close to the top. It's a classic symbol, right? Exercise of futility. Camus attributes this futility to sort of what human life is in general. In a literal sense, he says that it's a life of a worker, right? Going to work every day, right? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, that kind of stuff. Enduring the toil, but there's no meaning to what the heck is going on, right? Except for the difference might be that the worker is less tragic because, unlike Sisyphus, the worker is often sort of less conscious of the futility, right? Now you may ask something like, "I'm tired of going to work." But that's different. That's a different than the futility of the work, right? For Camus, Sisyphus is sort of a hero, right? The absurd hero, and the hero of philosophy that can move, right? He wants to promote this hero because he rebelled against the gods, right? In terms of Sisyphus, he rebelled against the gods, and is absurdly passionate for life, no matter how futile, right? So no matter how crazy it is, Sisyphus is constantly doing and constantly pushing, right? Sisyphus sort of rejects the transcendent illusion of worlds and gods and commits fully to the absurdity of this one, right? Existence precedes essence kind of thing. It's all about what's going on right here, not in the afterlife, that kind of thing, right? So he doesn't really get down. Sisyphus doesn't acknowledge the illusory worlds of gods. He just gets down with what's happening on Earth, and does it in kind of in a rebellious manner. Yeah, he has to do this every time, this sort of toil of pushing the boulder up. But Camus is also interested in what is happening when he is walking back down the hill. So that's the second question, right, to think about, right? Not just, what's the purpose of pushing the boulder up the hill, but when the boulder goes down, now he has to walk down and do it again. Like, what's going on philosophically at that time, right? The walking down the hill, right? And you'll see this in the reading because he calls it the hour of consciousness, right? And the hour of consciousness is sort of this sort of tragic experience of the absurd, right? Excuse me. Camus argues that Sisyphus can descend, go back down happily, not only because happiness and the absurd are necessarily connected to him, right? We're both meant to be happy. We're both meant to sort of experience this crazy thing called life, right? But they both take place only in this world at this point, right? This worldly, not otherworldly, but this worldly. And so it's not his destiny, right? Or I'm sorry, right? It's not his destiny in terms of essence. It's his destiny in terms of his existence, right? And so his the rock becomes his current existence, his current destiny. No matter how absurd, the rock belongs to him, right? It's his issue, his problem, and he rebelliously chooses it, and Sisyphus, sort of in the story, you'll see he denied the guards, which are illusions, for and sticks to his rock, right? And so, and I can't wait to our conversation about that. But especially ask the question: can he be? Can he consider himself blessed and happy during the absurdity, during the toil, during the futility, or is his happiness because of the experience, right, or something like that? We'll have to talk that out. um, I like to call Camus a sort of a committed skeptic, right? He argues that for humans, understanding the world is to sort of necessarily reduce it to the human. In this sense, everything is sort of an anthropomorphism. It's not about God versus man. It's not about, and this is kind of like Nietzsche in a sense, right? But everything is reduced to the human element, right? We cannot, ever really look at anything truly objectively, according to Camus, neither in terms of logic, science, psychology. Why? Because our minds and our passions are already involved in interpreting and corrupting everything that we engage in, right? So on top of this, there is a sort of a generally and ultimately ultimate meaninglessness, not only to our allies but to the whole world, to the whole universe, right? Um, you know, you know, one can scientifically explain the world in terms of atoms, molecules, bangs, all that kind of stuff. But the question can always be asked about its necessity. Why? Right? Even the most basic forces of nature seem contingent and without ultimate necessity. If one uses intelligence, and I want you to think about that. I'm curious to see what Webby thinks about that line. That the most basic forces of nature seems contingent, right? Contingent to something else, and without ultimate necessity. It ain't like it was. Well, I don't know. I'm curious to see what that, and obviously, Phil, because I think Phil, you would think that there is ultimate necessity. If one uses intelligence as opposed to sort of blind reason, for instance, one recognizes that it's sort of almost inherently absurd of the world to think that it's about necessity. But I think, y'all, it's important to sort of understand or to note that the world itself is not reasonable, and even human alone is not absurd. The absurd, according to Camus, it more rightly depends on both the human and the world and their interaction, right? It's not an absurd world or an absurd person. It's the interaction of the person within the world. So the absurd then is a structural dynamic between the human and the world. And once you realize the structural dynamic, it becomes a heartbreaking passion. The question is whether we can live with this. These passions that Camus answers is that one can, through a sort of an active rebellion. One has to live and confront the absurd rebellion, an active resignation, right? You remember that word through Nietzsche, right? To one's own absurd reality or even destiny. One has to live it. One has to confront it. And confront what is the it? The absurd rebellion, the world, the me. And the resignation that the destiny is absurd. This actually distances one from suicide. Because suicide is not a rebellion, right? See how he played that trick on you? Suicide is not a rebellion. For some, it is an acceptance of the limits. Suicide may, in fact, resolve the absurd by eliminating it in a certain manner. I'm dead, I ain't got to deal with the confrontation. However, the end of the absurd is that it cannot be resolved, even by suicide. Considering that sort of one needs to live one's absurdity, an act of rebellion, and thus escape it through suicide is not the answer to Camus. Because it submits to it. Suicide submits to it. It's not an answer to it. So this is why Sisyphus is a, sort of the myth of Sisyphus is a hero, maybe an anti-hero, I don't know. And we see it in some of his other novels, right? But for Camus, the absurd makes it clear that there is no tomorrow. In a rather profound sense, and without this, one, sort of cannot really have projects or values or goals or responsibilities. Now, let me get it right. We all fake it and front it like we do in order to kind of keep the ball rolling, if you will. But in reality, we constantly got to face the world versus the human. And that overarches what you got planned for next Thursday. For Camus, sort of responsibility sort of also falls victim to the absurdity of believing that life has choices, preferences, and this is how he diverts from Sartre and even Kierkegaard, where you'll see me come in a little bit later. Because in Kierkegaard or in Sartre, as opposed to Camus, in the sort of in these conceptions, as well as politically and practically, Camus diverges. And as you've seen in the Myth of Sisyphus, as you will see if you haven't already read it for tomorrow, but the Myth of Sisyphus contains sort of really a lot of absurdist, rebellious theory, and even manifesto. And indeed, many of his later works sort of fleshes this stuff out and explores them in novel form, like The Stranger, for instance, right? Which we read, right? Remember? Right? The Stranger we read first, the first thing we read, right? And so it's sort of this indifferent French Algerian man. Begins with what? The death of the mother, right? But he doesn't feel too much because of death. He engages in life to various extents, including a personal and sexual relationship with Marie. But he seems to what? Feel very little. Except for a sort of a pervasive, ongoing absurdity and sense of profound detachment. And finally, we know he rebels sort of by killing a man who was in dispute with one of his neighbors. But he ain't really care about that either. And then through this act of rebellion, he is tried and sentenced to death. And we didn't read the second part, but some of you did. But in the second part, in prison, Meursault's sort of detachment remains or even increases. It even seems to help him to forget and stop desiring Marie, for instance. It seems like a quiet, indifferent rebellion. Although he does also have a sort of a powerful outburst against the prison chaplain, where he denounces the whole world and the whole life as absurd, and the worry with God as a complete waste of time, right? Generally, sort of one might say that, he is a stranger to oneself and everybody else. And this is at least honest. Why? Because that is, according to the existentialists, the human condition. That we're a stranger to ourselves and to others. Therefore, he rebels because he simply can. And not only can he simply can, but he has nothing else to do but to rebel. And this is how he picks up, a little bit from the Myth of Sisyphus, right? And you see more about the characters and tropes that sort of bring to life Camus' philosophy. Right? Now, we're not going to read The Plague and stuff like that, so I'll probably just stop there. But if you want to read some more Camus, you should probably read The Plague. Right? That's dark, right? It is dark. But But I think Camus is undoubtedly, you know, the main absurdist writer in philosophy and literature, right? He's mixed with themes like freedom, rebellion, self-understanding, beauty, conscience. He is still sort of widely read and studied today, and although he rejected the label of existentialist, he is unquestionably another main contributor to the general existentialist movement, which is why we're reading it. All right, so that's it. I'll see you in class. For those who are watching this video in another way, I am Julius Bailey, professor of philosophy at Wittenberg, and this is a part of my existentialism course for spring 2021. Take care.